And then finally, what about individualism? Well, individualism is what it is. It's got strengths and weaknesses, and the main problem with individualism in the modern world actually is the decline of hierarchy and solidarity. It's created a vacuum, and individualism has come into that vacuum, and it's kind of overburdened. But it's also the case that individualism has become narrow and materialistic, and there are particular reasons for that. There's the myth from neoclassical economics, the myth of Homo economicus, that we're all perfectly informed, utility-maximizing individuals. Now that, of course, has been a theory which was already a bit ludicrous, has been blown out of the water pretty much by the credit crunch. I don't remember, Alan Greenspan, one of the greatest understatements of all time, was asked immediately after collapse of Lehman what he thought of that theory, and he said, well, I think he said maybe there's a flaw in the theory, he argued. So we had that ideology. Of course, we've also got the propaganda of consumerism. You know, as you walk home tonight, there'll be lots of consumer messages to tell you that being a kind of materialistic individual is great because you're worth it. And also, this is just because this is how the world feels to us. We know from all sorts of experiments that we systematically exaggerate the degree to which what we do and who we are is the result of our individual choices, and we systematically underestimate the degree to which who we are and what we do is a consequence of the social context in which we operate. So, this is my argument, that we live in a society where hierarchy is enfeebled, social solidarity is weakened, and individualism is overburdened, and it's a narrow form of individualism. Now, what is the consequence of that? Well, I think there are two consequences of that. One, which I've already referred to. And the first consequence is that we're just not developing the kinds of solutions that mobilize all those forms of social power. One example I'd give is, why is it in the face of inequality in society that the answer every politician seems to agree on is social mobility? The idea that picking a few talented individuals out of poor communities and progressing them, even if we could do it, and we don't seem to know how to do it, the idea that it would actually concentrate disadvantage in the poorest communities does nothing about the overall levels of justice and inclusion in society. It seems like the only response people can have to a big social problem like injustice is a highly individualistic response. Let's find some individuals and save them. But looking at it from other angles, you can see also that narrowness. A few weeks ago, there was a report on old people in hospital, which found that old people in hospital were very often in very squalid conditions. Their bed was wet, they were hungry, they were in a terrible way. Now, the conclusion to that report, because we tend to look at things through a hierarchical lens very often when it's the state involved, was it's the fault of managers, it was the fault of nurses. In fact, someone made the suggestion, which seemed to be a bit ludicrous, that we should teach nurses compassion. This is obviously the problem. Now, my response to that story was this. I have seen people at the end of their lives, and I've seen people in those situations of dependency, and I can tell you what the critical variable is for how they're treated. The critical variable is whether they have loved ones visiting them. So actually, whilst there might have been a managerial failure and a nursing failure, it's also a failure of the social isolation of older people. The solution may be to teach nurses compassion and get better managers. The best solution actually is that we don't have so many older people who are in hospitals and in homes on their own with nobody to argue for them and communicate them and spend time with them. So this is a much broader question of social responsibility in response to ageing people. But let's have a neat solution. Let's just blame it on the managers and nurses. And I've seen this time and again. You know, Labour committed to abolishing child poverty. It's a great and noble aim. It should have been something that mobilised the whole country and where we thought about how it is we could inspire the individual aspirations of poor families. Instead, it became something which the Treasury did to people through clever tax credits, through technocratic solutions. David Cameron argued for the big society. I love the idea of the big society. It's a strong notion of solidarity, renewing solidarity. David Cameron recognised this. The problem is, he had no account of why individuals would want to suddenly start volunteering, and he totally failed to get Whitehall behind this idea. So it just remained as a kind of pious notion floating around. So the first consequence of us not mobilising individualism, hierarchy and solidarity together is we come up with feeble solutions to big problems. And when you watch the politicians speak at party conference, what you'll see is high-flown rhetoric about values and then little tiny solutions, and you'll wonder, why is there this huge imbalance between these values and these little tiny ideas that they've got? I'm offering you a solution, an explanation for that. But there's something else that's happened. There's another consequence of this imbalance. And when I was researching this speech, I came across an amazing speech given by Jimmy Carter, the American president, in 1979. And I just want to play you a few seconds of that speech.
it's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession. So I want to speak to you first tonight about a subject even more serious than energy or inflation. I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation.
Now, about 4 days after that, the White House collapsed, and a year after that, Jimmy Carter lost power. So you can see why politicians have not found that a message they want to copy. But what Jimmy Carter was incredibly brave. It's a brilliant speech, by the way. It was worth watching all of it. And in fact, the public reaction immediately after it was quite good, but Carter's problems are much more fundamental politically. But what Carter was identifying for the first time was that American people did not believe the future would be better than the past, and he thought that was a remarkable and frightening thing. Ever since then, although there have been cycles, that social pessimism has deepened. And what polls find again and again is this: that individually, we tend to exaggerate our prospects. I'm afraid none of you are going to do quite as well as you think you're going to do. But socially, we are deeply pessimistic. We think the world is worse than it is, and we don't think it's going to get any better. And this social pessimism, which I believe is a reflection of some of the forces I'm talking about, that unbalancing, is in danger of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, okay, lots of big ideas. But what are the implications of this? Does it have any is there anything we can do about it practically? Well, I want to suggest three. And the first is itself quite abstract, but it matters to me because I was trained as a sociologist, if that's not a contradiction in terms. So the first point I want to make is that I think we should try and think about society as a whole. It's kind of gone out of fashion. When I was at university, there were theorists who tried to think about society as a whole, as a functioning whole. And that, as I say, it's gone out of fashion, but I think we should do that. We should try to understand society as a whole. And part of the reason that went out of fashion is that it was associated with a school of thought called functionalism, which said that society does function as a unit and it all fits together. And that theory was discredited partly because people said, well, what about conflict and what about complexity? It's all too neat. Now, I want to suggest that my account enables us to bring together a view of society with complexity and with conflict. Because not only is it the case that we need solutions which combine individualism, hierarchical authority and solidarity, but the fascinating thing is these solutions will never be very stable, and the reason for that is because all of these perspectives hate each other. There is a fundamental conflict between these different ways of viewing the world, so just as we try and push them together, they will always be jostling with each other. In fact, they get their energy from their opposition to each other. You know, hierarchies get their energy from the fact they've got to control the risk-taking individualists and the backward-looking people organising the demo or whatever. People in solidaristic organisations are always against the hierarchy, and again, they're threatened by individualism. I saw a great example of this a few weeks ago, going from the grand to the very parochial, a few months ago. I was at an underground station, and people were queuing up because the trains were delayed. And so we're all standing in the queue. So this queue was a combination of two of the things I've described to you, hierarchy, but also that fatalism I discussed. We would stand in the queue because we were told to stand in the queue. The orders were to stand in the queue, and we were standing in the queue because everything bloody well goes wrong and I'm never on time for work, right? That was the. Then what happened was a few people, they might have been in a hurry, they might have been megalomaniacs, I don't know, but they realized that you could duck under the barrier and you could walk up the exit and get to the front of the queue. So a few people did this. And what was interesting was the queue changed its form. We started murmuring to each other. And we stopped being just a hierarchical queue and we became a solidaristic queue. We were a queue defined by the fact that we subscribed to the values of queuing as distinct from these horrible individualists who were doing their own thing. So I want to argue that we can think about society as a whole and we can understand how it functions and we can recognise the need for these three forces to be held together whilst recognising that there are also kind of centrifugal forces which mean that they're always fighting each other and that solutions are never fully stable.